Welcome to the Royal Society's Centre for History of Science. Our speaker today is Professor Elizabeth Valentine, who is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London. And the title of her talk today is Spooks and Spoofs, Psychologists and Psychical Research in the Interwar Years.
Thank you very much, Felicity, and thank you very much for the invitation to give this lecture. This talk explores the involvement of 6 senior academic psychologists in psychical research in the interwar period. So I'll say a little bit about the relationship between psychology and psychical research in the late 19th and early 20th century, and move on to the interwar period, and then talk about Harry Price's National Laboratory of Psychical Research and his University of London Council for Psychical Investigation. Then I'll say a bit about the psychologists involved, for those of you who are less familiar with them, and lastly address my main research question, which was why did these psychologists get involved in psychical research at this time, and in particular with Harry Price. Psychical research was born in the spiritualist era towards the end of the 19th century. Indeed, several physicist fellows of the Royal Society were noted for their interest in the topic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Balfour Stewart, Sir William Crookes, Lord Rayleigh, Sir William Barrett, and Sir Oliver Lodge were all presidents of the Society for Psychical Research, which I may hereafter refer to as SPR, or the Society for short. Incidentally, apparently, so I've been told, all presidential addresses of the SPR are given at the Royal Society. Somebody can confirm whether that's correct. However, one might think that psychology is as relevant, if not more relevant, than physics to psychical research. During this early period, there were close links between psychical research and mainstream psychology, and I've been aware of this sort of vaguely for some time. Many psychologists were members of the Society. William James, William McDougall, T.W. Mitchell, Robert Thales, and Gardner Murphy were all presidents, and corresponding members included the clinicians Theodor Flournoy, Sigmund Freud, Pierre Janet, Carl Jung, Stanley Hall, and Morton Prince. Frederick Myers, a founder member and chief researcher of the Society for Psychical Research, was Joint Secretary of the Second International Congress of Experimental Psychology, held in London in 1892, half of which was devoted to hypnotism and related topics. There were also close relations between psychical research and psychoanalysis. James Keeley has cogently argued that Freud had a lifetime interest in psychical research, and that it played a crucial role in the development of psychoanalytic theory, providing Freud both with many of his ideas and with the stimulus for their development. The Society was also the route by which Freud's work became known in England. But I was surprised to find such an interest in psychical research continuing as late as the 1930s. I came across something called the University of London Council for Psychical Investigation, and I wondered what on earth this could have been and how it could have come about. Further investigation revealed that William McDougall, FRS, and William Brown, an academic psychologist and psychotherapist, attended a number of séances arranged by Harry Price, of whom more anon, and that Jack Flugel, Alec Mace, Cyril Burt, and Francis Aveling, all London-based academic psychologists, were members of Price's University of London Council for Psychical Investigation and supported psychical research in various ways. Price, an amateur psychical researcher, was a controversial figure whom The Economist described as a rogue, a falsifier, and a manufacturer of evidence. The question I wished to address was, why did academic psychologists get involved in psychical research during this period and cooperate with someone of dubious integrity and lacking scientific credentials? So I'll move on to the interwar period. In fact, there was considerable activity in the area of psychical research in the interwar years. The First World War had led to an increased interest in telepathy and the possibility of survival after death as a result of the massive number of bereavements. The bereaved consulted mediums in the hope of contacting their deceased relatives. It is perhaps not without significance that many of those interested in psychical research notably Oliver Lodge, Arthur Conan Doyle and Samuel Sowell, had lost relatives in the trenches, though it may be oversimplified to suggest that a hope of contacting the deceased was their sole motive. An examination of the relevant databases for occurrences of psychical research in both Nature and the Times shows they peaked during the 1920s and 30s, contrary to Brian Inglis's claim in his book Science and Parascience that Nature rarely permitted itself to consider the topic. Here are the figures for occurrences of articles on psychical research in Nature and references to psychical research in the Times, and you can see in both cases there's a big peak in the 20s and 30s. Membership of the Society for Psychical Research reached a peak in 1920, but by 1930 it had dropped to almost half this figure. The Society was in disarray, split by factions. There were disputes about both metaphysical and methodological issues. The so-called left wing contained spiritualists or others dedicated to seeking evidence for survival after death, whilst the more conservative right wing were intent merely on demonstrating the inadequacy of what they regarded as materialistic and mechanistic dogmas. The high and dry faction of the Society strove to maintain rigorous scientific standards, whereas the not high and dry school questioned the appropriateness of such methods for the study of psychical phenomena, arguing that the craving for scientific respectability had distracted attention from spontaneous phenomena. Many considered the experimental approach counterproductive in this area, and that introducing the necessary controls militates against the production of supernormal phenomena. The study of physical mediums, either those demonstrating physically observable phenomena, such as telekinesis, apports, the apparent appearance or movement of an object counter to natural laws, the production of ectoplasm and pseudopods, demonstrated the impossibility of full control and the consequent difficulty of conclusively ruling out fraud, often compounded by financial interests on the part of the mediums. A number of rival institutions stepped into the breach. The British College of Psychic Science was founded in 1920. Although eclectic in spirit, it favoured a human and practical approach rather than a cold and often negative scientific attitude. And most of the reports in its journal, Psychic Science, relied on personal experiences and anecdotal evidence. The International Institute for Psychical Research was established in 1934, also spiritualist in inspiration, whilst claiming to be scientific. Although it was initially supported by reputable scientists, including the biologist Julian Huxley, FRS, they resigned after a few months when its survivalist leanings became clear, and the institute merged with the British College of Psychic Science. In between these, the National Laboratory of Psychical Research was set up in 1926 by Harry Price. Harry Price, who was born in 1881 and died in 1948, was a businessman and amateur psychical researcher. A salesman for 40 years for paper merchants, he was a man with many skills: conjurer, he was a member of the Inner Magic Circle, photographer, engineer, numismatist, writer, journalist, and bibliophile. Richard Morris, in his biography, describes him as a supreme bluffer, a hedonistic conman, a terrific raconteur, a great conjurer, a gifted writer, and a wonderful eccentric. Defensive about his working-class origins, Price sought academic recognition. His lifelong passion was psychical research, to which he devoted an enormous amount of energy and finances. But his approaches and values were those of a businessman rather than a scientist. He craved fame and publicity and was prepared to sacrifice truth and integrity in pursuit of them if necessary. Although a lifelong member of the Society for Psychical Research, which he joined in 1920, the two were at daggers drawn. The National Laboratory of Psychical Research was founded, so he tells us, to investigate in a dispassionate manner and by purely scientific means every phase of psychic or alleged psychic phenomena, and to provide facilities for experimentation. Campbell Swinton, FRS, the television pioneer, suggested that Price had named it thus so that people would think it was on a par with the National Physical Laboratory. It was formally opened in typical Price fashion in a flurry of media attention. Within a very short time, membership of the laboratory topped the 800 mark, rivaling that of the Society for Psychical Research. The psychologists William Brown, William McDougall, and Jack Flugel were members of a London group available for participating in experimental work, and Flugel was on its board. Between 1926 and 32, the laboratory carried out a series of sittings with mostly physical mediums, including the Austrian Rudi Schneider and the Scotswoman Helen Duncan. Physical mediums had the dual advantage of providing objectively observable hard data to satisfy scientists and suitable fodder for newspaper publicity to satisfy the general populace. Price aimed to appeal to both scientists and the lay public. In fact, initially, experimental seances, to which scientists were invited, alternated with demonstrations for interested others. Great emphasis was placed on the properly equipped seance room. The laboratory owned 14 cameras. A dictaphone was used on one occasion to record the voice of a trance personality. There were ultraviolet and infrared installations, the latter being used to detect apports, objects moving supernaturally. A bell rang if the beam was interrupted. There were rheostats, a luminous watch for timing, thermographs, barographs, and other instruments for recording the meteorological conditions. X-ray apparatus was even on hand if necessary. A number of precautions were aimed at preventing cheating. The medium was searched internally and externally. Helen Duncan's rectum, so we're told, was examined for some distance up the alimentary canal, and a very thorough vaginal examination given by Molly Goldney, who had trained and worked for many months in a midwifery hospital. McDougall and Brown, both qualified doctors, performed medical examinations, examining her throat, mouth, and teeth. Duncan was then sewn into a one-piece garment to which luminous strips were attached, as they were to various objects in the seance room. In the case of Rudi Schneider, a method of electrical control was used. The medium and sitters wore gloves and socks containing metallic strips. They placed their feet on metal plates and grasped the hands of their neighbours. If the circuit was broken, a light came on. In addition, the medium's hands and feet were also held by controllers. 3 series of sittings, totaling over 50 seances, were held with Willie Schneider between 1929 and 32. William Brown was present at 7 of them. He took part in searching the medium, acted as one of the controllers, and took some physiological measures. On one occasion, in May 1932, William Brown witnessed magnificent phenomena: moving curtains, ringing bells, cold breezes, table knocks, a flower taken out of his hand, and a basket moving on his knee. He was so impressed that he wrote a letter to the Times. It gave a detailed account of his experiences at the séance, in which he referred to some unseen agency and some mysterious power, concluding that undoubtedly the phenomena are worthy of the closest scientific investigation. The following week there was a partial recount. Anita Gregory, who happened to have been the stepmother of Richard Gregory O4S, provides evidence that Brown was ridiculed by colleagues at Oxford. In his second letter, Brown said, although he had originally been convinced that the phenomena were supernormal, intellectual conviction can only come, if at all, after much more stringent scientific investigation carried out in a university laboratory or in the séance room of the SPR, with trained scientists and psychical researchers as sitters. This infuriated Price, who felt that his work was being denigrated. A series of 5 séances with Helen Duncan was held in 1931. Known as Hellish Nell on account of her tomboyish nonconformity, Duncan was a Scottish housewife, a sometime Bleach Works employee, who married a cabinet maker injured in the First World War, here they are, by whom she had 12 pregnancies and 6 surviving children. She weighed 17 stone and worked as a medium. McDougall and Flugel each attended 2 of the séances, and Brown 3. Duncan's act was to enter a cabinet, a curtained-off recess in the séance room, which you can see here, go into trance, get taken over by a control, or trance personality, and produce ectoplasm, taken as materializations of the dead by bereaved sitters. After the first informal séance, Price wrote to McDougall, who had been unable to attend. We had a brilliant evening last night. The medium underwent a rectal and vaginal examination with Dr. William Brown and Mrs. Goldney and was sewn up into a one-piece garment. In 30 seconds after going into trance, the teleplasm streamed from her, and I secured 5 magnificent photographs. Here's one of them. It rapidly became clear, however, that what Duncan was doing was swallowing and regurgitating cheesecloth when in the cabinet, unseen by sitters in the red light. Photographs showed the warp and weft, selvage, and rents in the material. Here is Price's account of the 4th séance, at which MacDougall, Brown, and Flugel were all present. We decided to X-ray her immediately after a séance, and before she had time to dispose of the stuff. We concluded that if we had the apparatus on view before the séance, the medium might not consent to sit at all, so we hid it in an anteroom. After the séance, and the appearance of the usual ghosts, and while Mrs. Duncan was coming out of the alleged trance, a couple of Messrs. Watson and Sons radiologists wheeled in the X-ray apparatus, a spectacular mass of plated tubing, coils, rheostats, wires, valves, etc. We then asked Mr. Duncan, who was present at every séance, to request his wife to be X-rayed. Mr. Duncan then spoke to his wife, advising her to submit, and he walked towards her. The approach of her husband seemed to infuriate her, and she became hysterical. She jumped up and dealt her husband a smashing blow on the face. She then made a lunge at Dr. William Brown, who dodged the blow. She then said she wanted to retire to the lavatory, and in order that she could be still kept under observation, a lady and Dr. Brown accompanied her. Then the medium changed her mind, I wonder why, said that she did not want to go, and sat down on a chair in the entrance hall. Dr. Brown, thinking she would like a drink, went to fetch a glass of water. Immediately, without the slightest warning, the medium jumped up, unfastened the door, and rushed into the street, where she had another attack of hysterics. Her husband dashed after her, followed by a procession of sitters in the following order: Dr. William Brown with a glass of water, Professor MacDougall with a towel, Professor Flugel, Professor Fraser Harris and Mr. Boyce, a lady with smelling salts, myself with brandy flask, kept for such emergencies, several sitters, the 2 radiologists. It was then striking midnight. We found Mrs. Duncan clutching the railings and screaming at the top of her voice. A crowd soon collected. Her husband tried to pacify her. The medium, who, as you will recall, weighed 17 stone, was of course still in her black sateen séance combinations. It was a most extraordinary sight. Then the police rushed up and an ambulance was sent for. However, Professor MacDougall and the other medical men present were able to satisfy the police that it was merely a woman in hysterics and that nothing serious was the matter. With this assurance and something of a more material nature, the officers departed. As we thought that the woman might have got rid of the cheesecloth during the chase, we asked her husband whether we could search him. He refused, which of course was suspicious. Mrs. Duncan could easily have passed the stuff to her husband while they were alone in the street, and this indeed subsequently turned out to be the case. The story was published in the Morning Post. Price's report concluded that all the manifestations were produced by normal, though exceedingly unusual means. MacDougall pronounced Duncan's whole performance fraudulent. As early as 1899, he had warned about sittings conducted in the dark by professional mediums who work for pay. Brown concurred. Nothing that I saw would have led me to attribute to her any supernormal or psychic power whatever. So now turn to the University of London. Price attempted to develop collaborative links with a number of institutions: the London Spiritualist Alliance, the Institut Metapsychique International in Paris, the British College of Psychic Science, and the SBR, but none came to fruition. When these approaches failed, he made a formal offer to the University of London in 1933 to found a department of psychical research. The offer included his laboratory and library, an extensive collection of books, including many rarities on psychical research, and a guaranteed income of £500 per annum. The proposal was considered by the Academic Council, the Board of the Faculty of Science, and the boards of study in what were considered relevant subjects, namely advanced medical studies, physiology, psychology, philosophy, physics, and theology. The Board of Studies in Psychology, as was its wont, set up a subcommittee to consider the matter. which was, after deliberation, was unanimously agreed that with certain restrictions, the abnormal phenomena hitherto included under the term psychical research form a suitable subject for postgraduate research. Undergraduate research was obviously considered too risky, but postgraduate was okay. The Academic Council concurred with the judgment that psychical research is a subject which can properly be included among the subjects of study of the university. The decision was subsequently ratified by the Senate, who approved the idea of a department of psychical research in principle, but cleverly deemed that space and financial limitations prevented its implementation in practice. No school of the university containing a psychology department was willing to accommodate the laboratory. It's been suggested that Price's plans constituted a threat to the university's resources and reputation. Nevertheless, the following year, Price managed to organise a so-called University of London Council for Psychical Investigation. This consisted of 10 academics, including 4 psychologists. J.C. Flugel, who was Assistant Professor of Psychology at University College, Cyril Burt, Professor of Psychology at UC, Alec Mace, lecturer and then in 1933 appointed Reader in Psychology at Bedford College, London, and Francis Aveling, Professor of Psychology at King's College. The Council undertook to supervise the work of the laboratory and to direct students in psychical research for higher degrees. For a while, Price succeeded in engaging both mainstream scientists and the general public by cultivating academics and courting journalists, such as the editor of Nature, the Listener, and the Daily Mail, who were all pals of his. During this time, he transferred his assets to the university. His library, having been rejected by the SPR, was handed over in November 1936, and it's still there. In July 1937, he was a guest of the university at a dinner in the Athenaeum, but the following year the council was disbanded. Price's behaviour upset several of his council members on account of his disregard for scientific integrity, his seeking of press publicity, and his failure to consult them before going ahead on such matters. Guy Brown, in particular, was obviously very concerned about his position at UCL. And Joad suggested that since the council wasn't anymore doing what it was originally set up to do, it might be better just to disband it. So in the end, Price's headstrong pursuit of publicity, if necessary at the expense of honesty, lost him academic support. So I'll now say something about the psychologists that won't be familiar to all of you. So as we've seen, 6 academic psychologists became associated with Harry Price's work on psychical research. William McDougall, William Brown, and J.C. Flugel attended seances at his laboratory. Flugel, Cyril Burt, Alec Mace, and Francis Aveling were all members of his University of London Council. All except Aveling were members of the Society for Psychical Research. So who were these people and how did they become interested in psychical research? William McDougall was a dominating force in British psychology for the first part of the 20th century. He held posts at University College London and Oxford University, where he held the wild readership in mental philosophy, before emigrating to the United States in 1920. Incidentally, he gave us the 2 main reasons for his emigration: that income tax was taking 1/3 of his income and that he was savage against the English climate. He worked first at Harvard before moving to Duke University in 1927, where he developed work on parapsychology with J.B. Rhine. McDougall was on the council of the SPR for over 20 years, and president of both that and the American Society, also playing a leading role in the founding of the Boston Society for Psychical Research. After he emigrated, he was in the habit, nevertheless, of spending the summers in England, which enabled him on occasion to attend seances at Harry Price's laboratory. Towards the end of his life, he confessed that had it not been necessary to earn a living, he might have chosen to devote all his time and energy to the field of psychical research. Interestingly, Freud made a similar confession. William Brown held academic posts at King's College London and at Oxford University, where he succeeded McDougall as Wild Reader in 1921. He was a consultant at the Royal Bethlehem Hospital, as well as conducting a private psychotherapy practice in Harley Street. Brown was a council member of the SPR. He became associated with Harry Price attending seances at the laboratory on 10 occasions. He took an active part in sittings with Rudy Schneider and Helen Duncan, and Price acknowledges his help. J.C. Flugel, known as Jack Flugel, was an important figure in British psychology in the interwar years, playing key roles in both the psychoanalytic movement and the British Psychological Society. Almost his entire career was spent at University College London. Flugel became well acquainted with Price. As secretary to the University of London's Board of Studies in Psychology, he played a key role in steering Price's offer through the university's labyrinth of boards and subcommittees. He was a member of the executive committee of Price's council and was involved in a number of investigations. Cyril Burt was the first professional psychologist in Britain, a psychologist to the London County Council's Education Department from 1913 to 32. He was then Professor of Psychology at University College London from 1931 to 50. Burt did not become a member of the Society for Psychical Research until 1959, perhaps for reasons of professional caution. He became associated with Price, was a member of his council, and provided facilities in his laboratory for Samuel Soule to carry out card-guessing experiments. In fact, he also had his wife doing card-guessing experiments. Both Price and Soule acknowledged his help, which included getting hold of participants for experiments. In his role as head of the psychology department at University College, he was the cautious recipient of equipment on the winding up of the University of London Council. Alec Mace, having set up a psychology laboratory at St Andrews University in Scotland, was appointed reader in psychology at Bedford College London in 1933, subsequently being promoted to the chair of psychology at Birkbeck. Bedford were too stingy to give him a chair, so he upped and went off. He was a member of the University of London Council for Psychical Investigation, and experiments on ESP were conducted in his laboratory for a number of years. Francis Aveling was appointed reader in psychology at King's College London in 1922, following William Brown as head of department, and succeeding to a chair in 1932, which he held until his death in 1941. He was for a time a Roman Catholic priest. Aveling was a reluctant member of Price's council, agreeing to serve provided he could play devil's advocate. But he nevertheless supervised a PhD by John Hettinger on the ultra-perceptive capacity, which was a sort of investigation of telepathic abilities. So I turn now finally to my main question, reasons for the psychologist's involvement. Why did they get involved in psychical research, and why in particular with Harry Price? Price was a controversial figure, frequently subject to charges of fraud and deception. Eric Dingwall, Molly Goldney and Trevor Hall's report on Borley Rectory, dubbed as the most haunted house in England, accused him of actually creating some of the phenomena himself. Trevor Hall, in his biography, has documented numerous cases in which Price manipulated evidence, perpetrated fraud, or distorted the truth if it suited him. On the other hand, he was genuinely passionate about psychical research, to which he devoted a very considerable amount of time, energy, and money, and he was critical. After all, most of his investigations turned out to be exposés. So why did reputable scientists and the University of London become involved with Price? How did the enigmatic and controversial father of modern ghost hunting, as Richard Morris dubs him, manage to inveigle a number of senior academic psychologists into collaborating with him? I suggest that there may be personal, philosophical, and socio-historical factors involved. So firstly, the personal ones. The personalities of some of the characters involved may go some way towards explaining the turn of events. Harry Price was charismatic and gave the appearance of honesty and plausibility. Charles Sutton of the Daily Mail said of him, "Harry was one of the most plausible rascals I ever had the pleasure of meeting. Frequently a kind and generous friend, he enjoyed wining and dining his guests. As Morris observes, he was an extremely likeable and lovable man, so few bothered to look beyond his affability." Perhaps the psychologists were gullible. Morris describes them as less circumspect. Some of the psychologists were affable too and keen to help. Their correspondence with Price was almost always cordial, expressing mutual interest in the phenomena under investigation. Ernest Jones, Freud's biographer, describes Flugel as a most lovable person. Few men, he says, could have been so universally liked. One psychologist in particular was largely responsible, I would suggest, William McDougall. It's significant that William Brown, Jack Flugel, and Cyril Burt were all students of his at Oxford. Indeed, Knight Dunlap reached a similar conclusion regarding McDougall's influence in regard to supporters of the parapsychologist J.B. Rhine. He writes, "They have all been, in the past and at impressionable ages, apprentices of McDougall, and came under the spell of his attractive personality." So secondly, the philosophical reasons, or the metaphysical position of the psychologists. The psychologist may be considered broad-minded or flaky according to one's theoretical predilections. But perhaps there are deeper philosophical reasons beyond mere flakiness or gullibility. McDougall and Brown were in the vitalist tradition. That is, they believed that living entities are distinguished from non-living by some non-physical or spiritual element. McDougall and Burt held explicitly dualist metaphysical theories about the relations between mental and physical. McDougall's psychology was based on what he called the Hormick principle. I had become more and more convinced that mechanistic biology was unsound, that in all living things there is some factor which does not work in accordance with mechanistic principles, and which has its own peculiar nature and organization. He regarded the principal importance of the results achieved by psychical research as having established the occurrence of phenomena which cannot be reconciled with the mechanistic scheme of things. He felt that orthodox science's assumptions of mechanism and materialism were dogmas. For him, the replacement of the two pillars of dogmatism, in his opinion, orthodox religion and scientific materialism, was a moral imperative. Burt expressed his dualist views on a number of occasions. For example, normal psychology reveals within itself an inescapable dualism, or on one occasion proclaiming there must be a ghost in the machine. And thirdly, socio-historical factors, or what I've called fluidity of boundaries. Psychology was in a state of transition in the interwar period, with fluid boundaries between academic psychology on the one hand, and both psychical research and popular psychology on the other. Psychology as a discipline in Britain at the turn of the century was an extremely small-scale operation and remained in a primitive state of development for several decades. Aveling, writing on the position of psychology in the 1930s, remarked, "Scientific psychology must still be said to be in a state of transition and not yet fully to have found its feet. Its progress has been beset by two perennial problems. Firstly, its ill-defined nature, it's diverse and fragmented. Flugel in 1933, after discussing 9 different schools, observed that although psychology has made great progress, it's still infantile, still relatively uncoordinated, admitting that it may still be uncertain about its own nature. The second problem was insecurity with respect to its scientific status, its precarious position as a science. Or as Matthew Thompson puts it, a discipline anxious to defend its own rather tenuous claims to scientific authority and firm disciplinary boundaries. Both these factors contributed to the importance of what has been called boundary work in the development of psychology. Boundary work is an attempt to create a public image for a science by contrasting it favourably with non-scientific activities in order to justify claims to authority and resources. Such activity may be used to achieve expansion, monopolization, or protection of autonomy over professional activities. In the present context, 2 boundaries are of particular interest, that between academic psychology and psychical research, and that between professional and popular psychology. So take the first pair first. Relation between academic psychology and psychical research. For the first part of the 20th century, there were fluid boundaries between academic psychology and psychical research. The terms psychological and psychical were used interchangeably up to about 1920 to mean mental as opposed to physical. Psychological sometimes being used to refer to what later became known as the paranormal. Cyril Burt considered the phenomena of psychical research to fall within the remit of psychology. He says, All the various manifestations which have formed the subject of psychical research are essentially psychological phenomena. Psychical processes and psychical phenomena form the very crux of psychology as a separate branch of science. The relation between supernormal phenomena, such as we've been considering here, and abnormal psychology was particularly close. As Price himself remarked at the council dinner held in his honour, departments of abnormal psychology or psychical research, they mean much the same thing. The trance states entered or supposedly entered by mediums were considered altered states of consciousness, abnormal phenomena worthy of scientific investigation. Now, the other pair, the relation between professional and popular or lay psychology. The proximity of professional to popular or lay psychology was particularly close. Matthew Thompson, in his recent book Psychological Subjects, even questions the division between professional and amateur up to about the Second World War. As psychology shifted away from philosophy towards the natural sciences, great emphasis was placed on detached observation, accurate measurement, and recording. Boundary work often involved the creation of material and social spaces, such as laboratories, which define scientific work. Technical equipment and specialized training became the hallmarks of scientific activity, hence the significance of Price's stress on all his equipment. Possibly the most significant reason for the cooperation between the psychologists and Harry Price was their mutual position poised between scientific and popular psychology. As noted earlier, Price was explicitly committed to engaging, even educating, as he saw it, both scientists and the general population. He was continually involved in a balancing act to appeal to both constituencies. His laboratory, equipment, and elaborate method of control designed to eliminate fraud were hallmarks of science. To the psychologists, he appeared as an impartial investigator. On the other hand, his publications in the popular press were aimed at gaining the support, both financial and otherwise, of the general public, including spiritualists. The psychologists, too, were concerned to demonstrate the relevance of their work to everyday life while asserting their authority and expertise. They cultivated mass audiences and sought practical applications for their research. They were all enthusiastic about what the new psychology could offer and wrote books aimed at educating the public in this regard. McDougall and Burt were regular broadcasters. Brown and Flugel wrote frequent letters to the Times. Brown, Burt, and Flugel were all consulted by government officials at various times. McDougall and Burt became particularly well known and were highly influential. McDougall wrote books of practical advice and published in popular series. Burt, too, came to be regarded as an expert by the public, contributing to lectures and debates, as well as writing and broadcasting. He was considered to have a natural and easy microphone manner. His popularity was established by books such as The Young Delinquent, which ran to many editions. Matthew Thompson, in fact, singles him out as an example of a psychologist who engaged in the balancing act of courting public appeal at the same time as asserting disciplinary authority. So to sum up, Price offered the psychologists access to subjects, people who apparently exhibited paranormal phenomena. He was able and willing to engage in the publicity necessary to secure them and to provide the funds necessary to maintain their services. The psychologists were thus able to acquire data under the controlled conditions of his laboratory relevant to their theories of mind. Furthermore, for most of them, such data held the additional promise of supporting metaphysical positions to which they were wedded. Both Price and the psychologists, in their different ways, courted public appeal while asserting scientific expertise and authority. The study of their interactions is thus of historical significance in revealing the interplay between the professional and the popular at this transitional period in the development of psychology as a discipline. And finally, I'd like to thank these people for help, mainly with the illustrations. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for such a fascinating talk. We've got plenty of time for questions, so would anyone like to ask one?
My name is Ray Ward, and I've long been interested in not paranormal phenomena, but why people believe in paranormal phenomena when there is, in my view, no concrete evidence for it. And I was my attention was drawn to this talk by an email from one of my contacts in the skeptical world. I was particularly interested in what you had to say about Cecil Burt, because I've long been interested in his life and career, and I've had 2 articles published mainly about the accusations of fraud, which emerged later. One thing that Burt said, which I think is particularly interesting, is that long ago, and this has now become a commonplace, he recommended that conjurers, magicians, should be included in any investigation of paranormal phenomena, because scientists deal with things, and things don't cheat. But when you're dealing with people, people do cheat, and people are all too ready to ascribe paranormal phenomena to what are often very simple conjuring tricks. The American psychologist Barry Singer described an experiment in which his own students, psychology students, were perfectly convinced that someone doing simple conjuring tricks, which even children can do, could not possibly be conjuring tricks and could only be attributed to the conjurer having paranormal powers. It really is that powerful. And even the most intelligent people can be fooled, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, whom you mentioned, who created the sharpest mind in fiction, Sherlock Holmes, and then himself fell for an obvious hoax like the Cottingley Fairies.
I think that's right. Yes, well, certainly that has been one approach that psychologists have taken. They've looked at the psychology of belief and deception and asked just the question you posed as to why people did believe. Sorry. And I think the advice to include conjurers in the experimental setup is a good one. I mean, as you say, many people were deceived. Perhaps conjurers are slightly better than other people at spotting the kinds of deception that these people might be engaging in.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. My name is Mary Moran. I'm an artist, writer, and a clairvoyant. And it's clear that the study of physical mediumship is comical and dismissible. What I'm finding and also the dualistic metaphysics of the spiritual and the ghosts up there and we down here being privileged to access there, I find that dismissible, particularly with current quantum physics and some psychologies. It seems old-fashioned and funny. What is interesting, however, and I'm wondering if psychologists have actually paid serious attention within cognitive science regarding things like precognition. I wondered, could precognition actually be a survival characteristic, perhaps more significant than running? For example, with a bear chasing you, we know why scientists say running is a survival characteristic. But if you knew on Monday that bear would be behind that tree on Tuesday at 1 o'clock, would you go there? So my own experience from childhood has been unusually accurate, not always, but very unusually accurate precognition. And I've always wondered why, because I've never believed in the supernaturalisms. And I would like to see science explain this, telepathy, those two mainly, I think, because it seems that they could have survival value, and they may be so deep and forgotten within our maybe species memory or whatever, but because of the dismissibility and comic aspect of what's gone before, people maybe don't want to look at that seriously. Maybe they're afraid.
There was certainly a lot of interest at the time in the book by J.W. Dunn on precognition that you may know about. And I was also picking up on something else you said. People like Burt did rely on or invoke quantum theory as a possible explanation for what the mechanisms might be. And William Brown, but he thought at that time it was premature to rely on quantum theory as a support, though it might in the future provide a theoretical background. It's one of the,
doing anything with this now?
can you answer that one? I think Chris French is the person to address that question too.
We have a question.
Okay.
My name's Claire Hirschman. That was a terrifically fascinating lecture. What fascinates me is the 1920s when Jung and Freud and everybody else was having a crack at consciousness, dreams. And Jung, I don't know if it was his PhD, but did a huge lot of research on his cousin who was a medium. And it seems that it was the spirit of the times. A lot of it got suppressed. And Jung himself did a series of seminars that then went off to Harvard called the Vision Seminars, which again was suppressed and were only published about 10 years ago. So it seems to be that psychoanalysis again was suppressing what people were completely fascinated by. And the question, I mean, I think it's very interesting that people were dying in the wars and things, but there's something else going on. Why Jung's book on, why Freud's book on dreams and things, why it should all be happening and bursting forth then. And certainly, I think she's called Mariana something or other, started the Harvard Clinic, and she had been the subject of the Vision Seminars. And it's extraordinary time, isn't it? Because it does seem very dead now. People are not that interested. And I don't know why they were so thrilled then.
Yeah, I think that's right. These things come in waves. But I mean, you might be interested in this work by James Keeley that I mentioned, who traces in detail the extent to which Freud was interested by Frederick Myers' work on the subliminal self. And he actually thought, I mean, Keeley argues that Freud actually got some of the ideas from Myers, but also Myers' work provided the stimulus for Freud developing many of his psychoanalytic ideas, because he saw Myers as a sort of a rival theory, and he wanted to establish psychoanalysis as something slightly different, emphasize.
It does have this underlying need to become unorthodox.
Sorry, becoming unorthodox, did you say?
Orthodox. No, I mean the whole thing of this woman going to Harvard and starting the Harvard Clinic. Because again, this desperate need they have not to be seen as hippies,
Thank you.
Helen Duncan was the last person to be prosecuted for witchcraft, wasn't she?
No, she was prosecuted under the Witchcraft Act, but she was actually accused of fraud.
You know, because she gave such accurate information about the sinking of a ship, which was classified.
Yes,
that
that's
was
right.
extremely detailed. So I don't think in all cases she was a total fraud. I think that was
sometimes
really
right.
bizarre what she was.
Yes. No, correct.
I think she totally wasn't a fraud a lot of the time.
Correct. Yeah, I would agree.
Thank you very much for a most interesting talk. You mention, in fact, a division between people who are more interested in psychical research and psychological research. Do you think it's a crucial factor that in the 1920s and 30s, statistical techniques, I'm thinking of the work of R.A. Fisher, Guinness Brewery's student statistician, and other people, do you think that played a big role in that or not? You didn't mention it explicitly.
No, I didn't.
You mentioned experimental methods.
Yes, no, I didn't go into that, but I think you're right, and it did. It certainly played an important role in the development of different. I mean, the study of physical mediums, I think, went out of fashion, perhaps because of all the problems with fraud and deception and a lot of card-guessing experiments, which incidentally were introduced originally by Oliver Lodge, I believe, interestingly. But I think you're right, the statistical techniques provided sophisticated methods of analysing the accuracy of guesses in, say, a card-guessing experiment. And I think that Bert's inclination towards psychical research is influenced perhaps both by his interest in consciousness, but also his interest in mathematical psychology. That's quite clear if you go into it. Yeah, you're right.
Thank you. I think you might have just answered my question, but I'll ask it anyway. You gave us a history from the late 19th century and said that in the 20s and 30s it didn't die out. And I'm just wondering, was there a shift in the kind, you mentioned ectoplasm and ESP, precognition's been mentioned. Was there a shift in the types of phenomena? Could you say a bit more about that?
Yes. Yeah, I think there was. If you look at the sort of things that the Society for Psychical Research were investigating in the late 19th century. There was stuff about cross correspondences. I think that you're absolutely right. They're a very interesting pattern to trace the different phenomena that were investigated and the different methods that were used. Then you get this sort of craze, if one can put it like that, for the physical mediums, and then that gets overtaken, I think, by much more tightly controlled laboratory experiments, really from the time of J.B. Ryan's work on parapsychology in the States, and then things take a much more detailed and focused and perhaps less interesting, less flamboyant methods were used. But yes, that I think that in itself would be a very interesting study. Thank you.
It struck me that during this period in the 20th century, there were some highly intelligent men who, J.B.S. Haldane, Sir Peter Medawar, John Maynard Smith, James Lovelock, Robert Trivers, and I could go on, who had an idea that communism, to be charitable, very left-of-centre views were a good idea, and in fact they were all intelligent enough to know that they were ostensibly non-viable propositions in the real world. And I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that neurologists are aware of a particular condition in a particular kind of epilepsy in which damage to the parietal lobes leads the patient to be overawed by that which they have a predilection to, rather than that which their frontal lobes may override as being cognitively not sensible. And yet they still persist in it anyway. And it strikes me that people, apart from the obvious venal people who were doing it for self-interested purposes, we can eliminate those. It strikes me that both in this field and other ostensibly non-viable fields, that I think people do have what amounts to a mental disorder. I would include religion in that as well. And if you think about it, the people that are engaged in these kind of things are just far too intelligent to not be able to cognitively realize that these things, the evidence against is overwhelming, and yet they still persist. And I postulate that the entire field, including communism, and very left-of-centre views that can never be viable, is a kind of mental disorder.
Well, maybe in some cases, but I don't think it counts for the whole. I mean, there's a well-known literature relating madness to genius, but I don't think it counts for the whole field.
I'm interested in Harry Price. You talked about the motivations of the psychologists, but he seems to fit with a certain type that appeared in spiritualism initially and parapsychology, in that he's seemingly genuine in his belief in these things, but he's also clearly, it seems, a fraudster and a con man to some extent. He invests a lot in what seems to be scientific investigation of this phenomenon. It's a bit like Daniel Home, who William Crookes investigated, was a similar type. That they seem to have that sort of split aspect, that they're conning people, but they're also genuinely committed. Do you have any thoughts about what it is that's really motivating those people?
Not beyond what you said, but I agree absolutely that one does get this split in Price, and you also get a split in his attitude according to who he's writing for. So it might, one way of pursuing this might be to look at the popular literature as well as the scientific literature, and just look at the different audiences he was directing himself to. But I think you're right, he's a very interesting and split, let's call him a split character. Interesting studies. I don't know enough about Hume to know whether that's true of him.
One would have thought that Madame Blavatsky, with the incorrectness of the grammar in itself sufficient to show that she was a fraud, and Theosophy would have been discredited in the 1890s. It was attractive to many intelligent people, as all these things are, scientists, in the wake of Darwinism, I think. But Theosophy is still flourishing. If you look at the website, it's a very, very active website.
Well, so is the Society for Psychical Research, as Felicity and I were discussing at lunch.